So welcome you all for the webinar, Transnational and Networked Empathy, Queer Activism in Indian Digital Diasporas, organized by the Canada-India Research Center for Learning and Engagement, Circle for short, at the University of Guelph. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. The University of Guelph resides on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize this gathering place where we work and learn is home to many past, present, and future First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our acknowledgement of the land is our declaration of our collective responsibility to this place and its people's histories, rights, and presence. We support and add our collective voice to the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee on the Indian Residential School to never forget, to hold governments and colonial forces to account, to seek redress and healing. My name is Dilshan Fernando. I'm a PhD student in sociology and international development here at the University of Guelph. I've been a part of Circle for the past 2 years in many capacities, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. Circle was established in February 2020 at the University of Guelph, the Canada-India Research Center for Learning and Engagement. And Circle aims to be an interdisciplinary nucleus in Canada for cutting-edge research on India, South Asia, and their diasporas, to showcase, advocate, catalyze, and foster equitable, respectful, and sustained exchange of knowledge between Canadian and Indian scholars on complex and emerging and unexplored topics related to sustainability and social and economic well-being. I'll put the website link on the chat after some time. You could explore wealth of resources what we have on our website. I also want to remind an upcoming event which Circle is proud of, that is the Circle Graduate South Asia Conference. This conference is for PhD students who are engaged in research related to India, South Asia, and Indian or South Asian diasporas. This is for the second. This conference is held for the second time. We had a very successful conference last year. This is a 3-day virtual conference, and we expect proposals and abstracts from all disciplines. It's a multidisciplinary conference, and the deadline for abstract submission is on July 10th. Okay. So coming to today's event, the title of our webinar today is Transnational and Networked Empathy, Queer Activism in Indian Digital Diasporas. Let me introduce Dr. Nanditha Narayanamoorthy. Dr. Narayanamoorthy is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a Siegel Family Endowment Fellow. Her work draws from a humanities-based framework to understand the relationship between technology and democracy and rethink digital infrastructure and platform design in the global South. As an interdisciplinary scholar at the intersection of critical digital studies, gender studies, and social justice, her work investigates the role digital infrastructures play in centering feminist and queer subaltern counterpublics online. She's published in feminist media studies and digital studies. If you want to look at Dr. Narayanamoorthy's work, I'm going to put in the chat one of my favorites. If you want to know about what happened in the Me Too India, which is an exciting piece, I just put it on the chat. Feel free to look at Dr. Narayanamoorthy's published work. So thank you so much, Dr. Narayanamoorthy. Welcome to this webinar. Before I give you the floor, I just want to remind our participants of the time allocation. So Dr. Narayanamoorthy will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. And after that, we will have a Q&A for 20 to 30 minutes. You can put your questions on the chat or raise your hand after Dr. Narayanamoorthy is done with the talk. So thank you so much. Thanks for joining. Over to you, Dr. Narayanamoorthy.
Thank you so much, Dilshan, for the warm introduction, and thank you for the invitation extended to me by the Canada Research Centre for Learning and Engagement at the University of Guelph. I'm really grateful to be here, and thanks for everyone for showing up. So I'm going to share my screen, and let me know if you can.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So as Dilshan said, I'm Nanditha. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina. And today my talk is going to be titled Transnational and Networked Empathy, Queer Activism in the Context of Indian Digital Diasporas. So this research that I will be talking about today is based on my first book project that is titled Queer Digital Activism in India, Networked Empathy, Kinship, and Solidarity. This is currently under contract with Palgrave Macmillan, and under this series specifically on mediating kinship, representation, and difference. So this book is, of course, not only about digital diasporas. It is thinking through queer activism based on the Indian queer movement, Section 377, and the discourse that's happening around the movement on social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram. But the scope of today's talk is going to be about digital diasporas and how they talk about Section 377. So as an international student living in Canada in 2018, I both witnessed and also participated in this rising digital celebration of newfound queer rights in India. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what Section 377 is. But this online movement paved the way essentially for paradigm rights for queer identity, sex, and desire in the country. And so as a comparatist and interdisciplinary scholar, I was really interested in thinking through some of the ways that activist discourse happens on social media technologies, and this fascination in turn shaped my research as well. So very broadly, I look at how communities engage with social media platforms for social organizing, and also how they create activist discourse in the context of the Global South, but particularly here in the Indian context. And my scope for this research, as I had already said, is to focus on digital diasporas. And so the question that I'm interested in asking is, how does the Indo-Canadian diaspora participate in the discourse around Section 377, on specifically Twitter and Instagram? And how is it that they are able to create these imagined communities of solidarity, support, allyship, friendship, and empathy for their queer Indian counterparts? So before I actually take you to talking about the research that I do, I wanted to highlight some of the key contributions that my work actually makes in this study, and I'll return to them in the findings section. So the first contribution that I make with my research is, of course, in thinking about networked empathy. So I talk about this concept in a way that defines how queer communities come together and coalesce around the discourse on Section 377, and how they create this collective identity and sort of a networked identity around discussions of queerness. Second, I talk about this idea of transnational solidarity, because, of course, the Indian digital diasporas are instrumental when thinking about the role that they play in creating awareness about queer identities and LGBTQ activism. And of course, we have to consider the aspect of solidarity when we talk about this particular work. And finally, I talk about queer subaltern counterpublics. So this is an idea that I borrow from Rohit Dasgupta, who's been very, very important to the work that I do on queer activism in India. And so the final queer subaltern counterpublics point is essentially my borrowing from Rohit Dasgupta to talk about this collective queer identity that digital diasporas are able to participate in. So a little bit of background on what is Section 377. So in order to study how social media, in order to study how social media's role is centering queer voices in India, I examine the queer movement around Section 377. So this is essentially an Indian law of the Indian Penal Code, which is a very archaic and colonial law. And until a recent momentous verdict by the Supreme Court of India in August 2008 criminalized homosexuality. And so it read, whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal shall be punished with imprisonment for life. So although it's not clearly stated, carnal intercourse against the order of nature in the Indian Penal Code alludes to sexual acts that are not necessarily always homosexual. They can mean it is part of heterosexuality as well. However, when it comes to criminalizing homosexual acts, Section 377 burdens LGBTQ communities and subjects in the country, and also those who are practicing homosexuality, and brings them out enforces them to essentially keep their lives a secret from their families, communities, and authorities. So a little bit of a timeline as to how Section 377 came to be and how it was decriminalized in the Indian context. So the law was first introduced by the British Raj in 1861, and it was a colonial experiment that was shaped by homophobic attitudes and imported to other colonial societies as well. So India was not the only society where Section 377 was implemented. Its colonial hegemony, primarily serving imperialist and Victorian interests, was adopted by the Indian Constitution in 1947 when India won its independence. And this became an instrument to police the masses using sexual, moral, and religious policing. And it became a vestigial reminder of colonial oppression. So the non-governmental organization NAS was the first to actually create awareness surrounding the spread of AIDS, and then it launched its own fight for legalization against Section 377 and for the decriminalization of homosexuality. And so it was NAS Foundation that really started this long or decade-long fight, I should say, until in August 2018, the Supreme Court finally read down the law. So diasporas have always occupied a liminal third space, enabling the reimagination of what constitutes a nation or the concept of a nation. So particularly in the context of Indian diasporas in the global north, identities have constantly oscillated between the discontinuity and fluidity. So it could be either thinking about digital diasporas and their role in fortifying the nation state in terms of a heteropatriarchal, very masculine society, or spearheading a very transnational queer supportive movement. Social media platforms actually enable both kinds of diasporic participation. And Indian diasporas in the early 80s and 90s were actually reinscribing notions of what it means to take a stance against this sort of foreign incursion of what queer sexuality meant at the time, and the intransience of the rejection of non-traditional and peripheral sexualities within this diaspora also kind of contributed to an anti-Indianness or an otherness that came with identifying as gay, being gay. However, as time passed, as LGBTQ activism is also something that India imported from the West, it also became true that digital diasporas increasingly participated in this transnational solidarity of the Desi queerness or the South Asian queerness, and in terms of thinking about challenging some of these notions of what it means to be a citizen of India. And secondly, diasporic identity has always also been built on the foundation of religion. Historically so, and is a part of a nation-building character. So whether it's thinking about Hinduism or Sikhism or Christianity or Muslim Indian communities, the Indian diasporic project in the West has largely been focused on religion. And contemporarily, I don't think we can dismiss the aspect of the Hindu nationalist society that has also promoted superiority of Hindu civilization and codes of sexuality in the West. Whether it is thinking about North American diasporas of India, or thinking about the UK and Caribbean or African countries, the Hindu diaspora has increasingly become a part of this conversation. And as Gopinath, who is an important scholar when it comes to discussing diasporas, Indian diasporas in the West, argues minoritized communities, including women, lower caste groups, and LGBTQI groups, and those who are deemed politically undesirable to serve the homeland's elite nationalist claims of heterosexual patriarchal logic, are in fact parts of this Hindu normative idea of sexuality. And so this transnational solidarity that digital diasporas espouse and support is in fact challenging these very notions of what it means to be this particular idea of a Hindu citizen. So despite being an extension of national identities, diasporic communities also help create what Appadare calls diasporic public spheres, and they enable this diffusion of Western norms of human rights into regulations and constitutions of the nation state. And even though they function through the production of nationalistic interests, at times they are also imbricated in, and they are produced through forces of transnational capitalism that they borrow from. So Western identity politics becomes an important manifestation of modern transnational LGBTQ movements. And it has always been this global narrative of what it means to be queer, and these different terms of like gay, lesbian, or even queer are in fact imported from the West. India does not have this terminology. And so the very idea of activism related to LGBTQ communities comes from the West. And so in this particular research, I also talk about LGBTQ organizations in the United States and Canada, and look at what they have been, how they have been involved in this discourse. And some of these organizations are Kush or Gazy or Share Vancouver that are within Canada. So I actually also use a number of theoretical frameworks to think about this particular research. I bring together a multitude of disciplines in my study of queer movements in India, and particularly I build on the scholarship on at the intersection of social media activism, digital subaltern counterpublics, and diaspora studies. So in the case of Section 377, members of the Indian diaspora engage in this transnationalist modern narrative and openly express support and solidarity with the decriminalization of homosexuality. So the Habermasian public sphere is the platform where all public opinions are formed, and conversations for private individuals can also be held. And so for me, the public sphere argument by Nancy Fraser is something that I really borrow from, and talk about this exclusion of certain LGBTQ groups and how they come together on social media platforms to create this digital subaltern counterpublic space. And so in the context of this particular research on diasporas, I talk about how diasporic discourse enables this sort of free space for the solidarity and support with the Indian queer movement. And with respect to social media activism, I go to Tufekci's Twitter and Tear Gas, and Moe Bailey, Sarah Jackson, and Brooke Foucault-Wellis's #Activism. And these two works have been instrumental in shaping the work that I do in the context of #Activism in the Global South. And I also draw very importantly from Rohit Dasgupta and Radhika Gajala, who contextualize queer activism in the context of Indian subaltern counterpublics. And with respect to diaspora studies, although I look at many prominent diaspora studies scholars, the most important ones to me are Appadare and Gopinath. So in this study, I combined multiple theoretical frameworks, So in this particular one, I look at queer theory and decolonial theory as well to kind of evoke this digital queer subject and to think about what it means to really belong. What does citizenship mean? What does belonging mean, especially for queer communities that are on the fringe, and how it is that digital diasporas are using or engaging these platforms to challenge heteronormative, masculine, homophobic power structures. So at the very center of all of my work is thinking about power. And so these theories help question power, institutions, and hierarchies of power for these marginalized communities. So with respect to methodologies, I bring together a number of qualitative frameworks to understand how the discourse actually takes place. And I, of course, bring together discourse analysis as well as visual analysis. And I consider this sort of like a mixed methods research that I'm doing, bringing together the work that I do on social media. So in the entire data set that I collected, I only had about 500 tweets that I was able to collect using the hashtag Section 377. And of course, I have to reemphasize that my research does not completely only entail digital diasporas. I also did research on India, collecting data from India. And so unfortunately, because of the limited number of people who use the location API for Canada on Twitter, I was only able to collect a limited data set from within this region. So in addition to looking at Section 377, I also examined certain LGBTQI organizations that were a part of the Indo-Canadian context. And the languages that I used to collect this data set were both in English and Hindi. And the timeline was between 2017, which was 1 year before the decriminalization happened, until 2019's August. So it's like a 2-year period before and after the Supreme Court actually read down the law. And similarly to Twitter, I also engaged in data collection with Instagram, and I also used the same hashtag to manually look for conversations that are happening in the diasporic space, which was a little bit more difficult than doing so on Twitter because Instagram does not have an API. And so I focused here on looking at Indo-Canadian LGBTQ organizations and the kinds of posts that they are making to engage with this discourse. And I used the Selenium browser automation method to sort of scroll through all of these posts and manually screenshot it every post that I thought was important. And so I ended up collecting a little bit fewer than 200 posts on Instagram. So you can see that this is a limited data set that I work with for this particular research question. And I conduct a discourse as well as a visual analysis of both of these, all of these posts that I collect. In other research that I do, I also follow what I call the deductive coding methodology, where I'm looking at the number of the statistical number of the tweets that actually follow a particular question, whether it's, you know, if you read my other papers on the exclusion with Me Too India or about homophobia in the queer movement in India, I showcase how many posts actually respond to that particular question. Whereas in this particular context of digital diasporas, I focused on manual content analysis and data collection. And so I use discourse and visual analysis to examine how these conversations are happening. And as you can see, my data set has been limited. And so the conclusions that I draw from this are, in fact, necessary and important, but of course come with certain caveats. In addition to that, there's also a lack of ethnographic components. I'm really interested in actually talking to some of these organizations and the people that are a part of it, but that research would happen later. This particular research is only focused on looking at digital discourse, and so that's what I'm focused on. So I wanted to go back to some of these key theoretical contributions that I talked about and focus on some of these findings at the moment. So I argue that social media platforms and hashtag activism provide the community with affordances for the construction of networks of empathy and within the queer Indian movement. And so the first point that I'm interested in making is about networked empathy and transnational diasporic solidarity. So the most important finding was that 54% of the Twitter data set that I found, and a slightly lesser percentage with respect to Instagram, actually indicated solidarity, support, and allyship with the Indian queer movement. And so most of these tweets were in English because it's coming from the West. There's relatively fewer tweets in Hindi, which I expected. And the diasporic discourse is all about celebration, jubilation, and pride about the emancipation of the community and about the reading down of Section 377. So all of the names here on these tweets have been anonymized or changed to ensure anonymity. But these are some examples that talk about how some of these users who come from the Indian diaspora are talking about Section 377, and in that they are actually in solidarity with everybody from India who's actually now able to live freely. And so this one person talks about how queerness has always been a Western concept. And so now homosexuality, which has always been a part of our culture, can be something that Indians can finally accept, because this is a way to connect with an India of a past. And so in essence, some of these comments are attempting to decolonize and to think about an India where sexuality was fluid and free. And so, and really challenging these notions of colonial interpretations of what sex and sexuality constituted. And on Instagram, about 14% of the images that I coded were depicting transnational solidarity in a different way. So images with pride colors were posted by individuals. They were posted by LGBTQ nonprofit organizations, some of these advocacy groups in support of the reading down of Section 377. And these pride images were employed in various different ways, whether it was thinking about flags or their clothes that people were wearing, or the food that they were eating. So this was all a rainbow of colors, and immediately following the decriminalization rule that came out in August. So the use of rainbows here in Instagram demonstrates solidarity. It demonstrates collective and connective action with the queer subaltern. And it facilitates the production of imagined collectives that reaffirm and legitimize non-normative love and queerness on digital spaces. And so this is another post that from Twitter that I took from the LGBTQ organization Siegel Family, that engages with Section 377, and it's been a very important aspect of storytelling within this entire conversation, where a lot of Indians have also, whether they are Desi and living in Western countries, or they're a part of India, have been actually using this as a platform to talk about their own stories of growing up queer, or completely using these platforms to come out in that way. And so I found this particular tweet that also performs the function as transnational solidarity through both images and text. And there's a picture of a clock or an alarm that the Indian Supreme Court has finally broken. And the next concept that I talk about is networked empathy. And how do I define empathy, and why is it important? So this is taken, I've actually defined and classified empathy in two very important ways in terms of how I see the discourse emerging. And so this is a way for me to classify some of these conversations. And the first is empathy emerges on around Section 377 in the digital diasporas through the expression of positive affirmation, whether it's through sentiments and feelings and expression of emotions like joy, hope, and pride, or it's through the expression of positive acknowledgement of queer rights. So one of the important reasons that I talk about networked empathy in this context is because the queer movement, even though it was very active on the streets and offline spaces, it has been the digital discourse coming from a very transnational perspective and a transnational pull from the diasporas that has really played a very important role and pushed the movements towards the legal emancipation from the Supreme Court for queer rights. And so this idea of digital citizenship has been very important for the entire queer community. And so this is a space where not just queer communities are able to participate, but everyone who is a part of the Indian diaspora who's able to engage in these conversations and help support and empathize with everyone from India who's actually a member of the LGBTQ community. So this is a graph basically that shows that this is the kind of discussion out of the 54% of tweets that were very supportive of the entire movement. It is these adjectives or like emotions that were used. And so as you can see, happiness and hope and pride are some of like the bigger emotions that are felt by some of these users. And this is a lot of these conversations were happening both prior as well as post the decriminalization of homosexuality. And here are some more examples that showcase how the diaspora expresses empathy for the Indian transgender. And so it's not just solidarity, but also essentially looking at how the LGBTQ community or the transgender community have been facing ostracization and putting themselves in their shoes to think about the kind of discrimination they have faced in society. And this is another organization called KUSH DC, which is a South Asian LGBTQ community that's based in Canada, that evokes this conversation about how Humsafar Trust in India was the very first organization to actually start talking about queer rights in the country. And they really use this conversation to empathize with how much there needs to be done and the kinds of issues that these communities actually go through. This brings me to the final point on queer digital subaltern counterpublics within digital diasporas. So diasporas in Canada employ social media platforms to create these imagined collectives that support queer rights in the country. So Rohit Dasgupta, as I mentioned earlier, is the one who really talks about this idea of queer subaltern counterpublics as spaces where a sexual revolution of sorts happens. And there's this reawakening of sexual revolutions in this case to talk about, to construct this subaltern culture, to create this safe space for conversation. And so I draw from his work to frame this queer subaltern space that digital diasporas are a part of, to not only think about how there is a queer politics of resistance that's being shaped here through the support, through the solidarity, allyship, friendship. It is also creating a notion of the collective, a collective queer identity within these imagined collectives. And so this collective queer identity is what I term the queer subaltern counterpublic space. So in my work, digital diasporas also help construct this subaltern space while participating in the exercise for collective and performative post-colonial identity building. So these networked counterpublics that lead to the production of post-colonial identity are made possible through #activism that not only are changing debates about how queerness is viewed in the country, but actually helping recenter and accelerate this process of decolonization by forging the means to dismantle colonial and post-colonial knowledge on queer sexuality. So it is through these expressions of solidarity and it is through expressions of empathy with the community in India that these spaces are created, and this space actually takes on the burden of the queer cause in India. So the networked voice here is constructed to combat and to challenge some of these heterosexual, homophobic, authoritarian views of sex and sexuality that are inherently Victorian, colonial, and post-colonial, and also nationalist. And so I argue that even in the absence of the subaltern counterpublic communities or the queer in India who cannot really talk for themselves or use these platforms in a way to completely live their authentic lives, the digital diasporas are in fact creating those spaces where they are able to not only create a collective queer identity, but also engaging in conversations that push some of these legal emancipatory spaces to come through. So finally, I wanted to talk about this idea of the zones of empathy that I draw from this work of networked empathy. So I argue that when it comes to zones of empathy, I'm not only talking about how queer communities engage with hashtags like Section 377. I'm also talking about how individuals in the diaspora community who are not in fact queer are also participating in these discourses. They're also using these hashtags to empathize with the movement and empathize with the communities. They are creating these spaces of connective and collective action. And in addition to just individuals, it's also non-governmental organizations or corporations or LGBTQ advocacy groups that are involved in conversations, as you saw, who also help push or carry this movement forward. So unfortunately, the subaltern is not very actively present, and this is a different kind of research that I'm talking about that I did, where I showcase that the queer subaltern, it does not participate enough on these platforms. I do show that there is these zones of queer empathy that are created, in fact, by those that empathize, by those that express their solidarity. So the digital diaspora here creates that network of empathy and transnational solidarity that help really push the movement forward. So to conclude, these mediated networks of affective empathy among this subaltern culture create a foundation for digital mobilization emerging from digital diasporas, and it culminates in queer emancipation in the country. So the Indo-Canadian diaspora is really performing the function of demonstrating care, compassion, affinity, rapport, and sympathy for these communities in India, and recognizing the everyday social and personal struggles that these communities and individuals within these communities face. So the affective solidarity and user support is built through hashtag connections, and it emerges through this open act of acknowledging the vulnerabilities of the subaltern group and also promoting these feelings of affection and attachment and belonging within these communities. And so these posts, some of the posts that I showcase, speak to the importance of fostering some of these social connections and this feeling of belonging and togetherness, both online and offline, in order to create this awareness for the struggle that these minoritized communities are facing. And eventually to enact not just a social change, but also a political and legal change in the country. And finally, collective action, according to the this particular conversation that I have talked about, evokes a sense of unity, and it evokes a sense of collective belonging and togetherness, and it fosters empathetic connections. And so eventually it leads to this construction of imagined collectives and queer subaltern spaces that completely redefines this idea of nationhood and what that constitutes, what nationhood, belonging, and citizenship means for queer communities who've always been at the fringe of society. And this collective action produces and performs solidarity through protest rituals, whether it's through sharing a lot of pictures that look very similar, dressing in certain colors, or holding flags. There is a certain affinity that's created with your counterparts, LGBTQ counterparts in India. And this creation of solidarity occurs through imagined collectives where participants are unaware of even the identities of who is participating. So there is a lack of the physical and material embodiment on digital platforms that actually promotes these kinds of imagined spaces or that become safe for the community to participate in, and also erases differences and privileges this sort of collective identity and the creation of empathy and empowerment that really takes or moves the movement forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Narayanamoorthy. That was a great talk. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Let's now open the dialogue for questions. I put it in the chat. If you have any question, you feel free to put it in the chat, as well as click the raise your hand option that's available on Zoom, and then I will give you the floor so you can read out the question. Let's, I see Rajendra Dudra. Do you want to read out your question, Rajendra?
Sure, thank you. Hello, Nalini. Thank you. Sorry, Nanditha.
No worries.
Hello, Nanditha. Sorry. Thank you very much for that paper. It was really clearly articulated, and I really enjoyed hearing the presentation. Thank you very much for that. Just a couple of questions. One, could you just talk a bit methodologically about your kind of data collection, particularly with Selenium, for those of us who might not be familiar with it? So the kind of strengths and weaknesses of doing that work. And then the second question is, I think you're absolutely right. It was a kind of a cause célèbre, a moment of celebration for the wider community with the doing away of this act and the way that you captured the celebration. But even in that moment and shortly after, are you able to say, or did you capture anything in the sense of not necessarily dissenting voices, but the heterogeneity of voices which you start to talk about towards the end of your talk? And I'm particularly thinking about the intersectionality of the haves and the haves not access to digital access. Did that come up in any way, even though a lot of the people were online and you were looking online? But I'm also thinking of, you know, other minority communities, women, the trans debate, the lit queer debate, or is that a completely kind of separate project and yours is one just kind of marking the moment of arrival and celebration? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajendra. That was they were very wonderful questions. Yeah, I'd like to address the first question about using Selenium methodologically. It was a challenge working with Instagram, for example, and I used Twitter for at the time when APIs were available, and I was able to easily extract the data using section 377. But of course, I also put in the filter for, you know, language and location that limited the amount of data that I was able to have access to. With respect to Instagram, what Selenium as a browser does is actually just I was able to download all of the data that I had at the same time, and then I was able to manually go through it to screenshot the posts that were important to the specific research question that I was asking. But Selenium essentially just sort of openly gives me all of the data under a single hashtag, because it's difficult to get all of the data at the same time, and I have to like scroll through, you know, because each hashtag that I'm looking at is about 30,000 or 50,000, you know, it's a lot of data that I have to parse through. So it just gives me access to all of it, and I'm able to screenshot it based on the timeline that I have and based on the specific research questions that I have. And for the second question that you asked, I think it's a very important question, and it's a great question. So my answer to that would be, so I was going into this particular research on digital diasporas, thinking about these sorts of nationalist discussions that are being had, and the exclusion of some of these communities, whether it's feminist or queer voices, and how that's actually happening on social media ever since the Hindu nationalist movement has been taking place since 2014 in the country. And so you're absolutely right. That's what I expected to go through, but unfortunately, the limited data set that I had only gave me this kind of discourse. So I expected to find dissenting voices, I expected to find a different type of discourse, but unfortunately, celebration, empathy, and solidarity is the singular kind of discourse that I found in this particular data set. But yes, I do work on a lot of these different questions as a bigger research project that I do. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are two questions in the chat. I'll read the first question and then come to Abby.
Okay.
Zabeen asks the question, I'm curious to know if network empathy expands to solidarity with non-Indian LGBTQ digital activism or other forms of justice.
I think that's a great question. So I would say that I'm not good. I don't know the answer to that question because I have not specifically looked at it. So the only locations that I have considered for this work are looking at the diasporic discourse in Canada, and also looking at the discourse on or around Section 377 in all of India. But I think it would be interesting to do more work on non-Indian LGBTQ activist organizations and what they have been saying. So thank you for that. Yes.
Okay. Abby, do you want to read out the question? Abby Silversmith?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was a bit concerned, on how solidarity is being defined here. Especially because there's expressions of look because I feel like this looks at one dimensionalizes the problem of what exactly counts as solidarity here, and and I think it is also important to look at larger critiques of a lot of these platforms that are mentioned, critiques of Ashok Kavi, critiques of Gacy, which have come from in queer and feminist activists and scholars. I just find it a little bit troubling that there was. I hope I was clear.
Thank you, Abby.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a great question. It's and you're absolutely right that there, it seems like it's one-dimensional. I think the reason that it seems that way is because of the kinds of discourse that are emerging. So I didn't, what I did with my methodology, in fact, was that I looked specifically for the conversations that were happening, and I took into account everything, all of the conversations that I saw happening that were coming from diasporic communities and spaces. And unfortunately, it all seemed to point to a particular argument. It was not an argument that I made in any way, but when it comes to questions of, solidarity and support in the Indian context, and, the discourse that's happening around Section 377 in India, and I have a lot of data on that. It's not limiting in any way. And so those conversations I found to be more interesting, and of course, pointing to a lot of different, types of discourse, which are not only about solidarity and networked empathy, but also about exclusion, about not really centering the voices of subaltern communities, whether it's feminist or queer communities. And so there's a lot to unpack there. But with respect to this particular research question, I think this is where it led me. But it's absolutely correct that I could consider thinking about some of the histories of these organizations and critiquing where necessary. But thank you so much.
Yeah. I have a small follow-up, if I may.
Yeah. Yes.
It's just that this is something that is concerning that I'm just seeing in the scholarship, in the diasporic scholarship, on how a lot of folks in the diaspora when doing studies seem to be a lot less nuanced than because the feminist, the the caste analysis, the feminist analysis, all of these are fundamental. It's how do you even look at queer solidarity in India without looking at the caste aspect?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great question. I think that unfortunately some of the discussions that people were having here were unidimensional, but these are not my work is actually not unidimensional when I talk about India. So in order to counteract this particular digital discourse, because of course it seems like it's heading in a very specific direction, and even with respect to APIs, those who choose to make their location public, for example, and those are the only tweets and Instagram posts that I was able to collect, it seems that they are very much in favor of the decriminalization, right? And so there not a lot of these conversations are happening that are critiquing or thinking about caste and feminism or other multitude of identity factors or ideas within this particular framework. But in order to add to this research, I'm also conducting a very ethnographic work, whether it's thinking about working with some of these organizations or talking to the Indian diaspora where I live in the US or in Canada, and ask these questions of what they think about the queer activism. And I'm like I said, I went into this research thinking that there would be a lot more nationalistic discourse as well, and there would be a lot more to parse from. But you're absolutely right that there could be more that comes out of this. But thank you.
Thank you. Kim has a question on the chat. Kim was wondering if you could touch on how the idea of queerness being wrong is colonial, but the LGBTQ2+ movement is also considered Western and criticized as a cultural colonialism.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, Kim asked the question. Kim is wondering if you could touch on how the idea of queerness being wrong is colonial, but the LGBTQ2+ movement is also considered Western and criticized as a cultural colonialism.
I think that's a great question, because there is this frequent tension that I saw within the Indian data set that I talked about, where there are two strands of either post-colonial as well as decolonial identity that were emerging. So for the first strand was thinking about just decolonizing, wanting nothing to do with this idea of sex and sexuality that colonizers have interpreted in a very specific way. And so this was a movement for them to essentially move away from a colonial interpretation and to really just go back to this India where sex and sexuality were both fluid. And there's this other discourse that was also happening that really showcased how they were more interested in moving forward in time to a more modern, progressive India, just like the West, because they were working with terminology that was Western. There was no way to understand what LGBTQ even meant, or what the term queer meant, or gay or lesbian. These are terms that we borrowed from the West. And so, since the movement itself was imported, this was a way for them to feel okay, we'll give the LGBTQ community all of the rights that they rightfully deserve. And so this was a way for India to actually become a more transnational and modern state. And this is where I think the diaspora really, really actually helped in these conversations. Yeah.
Thank you, Nanditha. There's another question from Anshu Jain.
Okay.
The question is, can you give some examples of care and empathy that is being networked, transacted, forged here? Anshu Jain is particularly wondering that both care and empathy are not one-way actions. That builds on Abhi's question. So how is care and empathy being understood?
So yeah, that's a great question. I think I would go back to the way that I was defining empathy. So it's more a way of like a lot of use of different sorts of like these positive adjectives, sentiments, and emotions to talk about the movement and to talk about their counterparts in who are LGBTQ in India, and also care and empathy is expressed by thinking about just positive affirmations and just making sure that they are putting themselves in the shoes of these communities and talking about what is needed, the kind of discrimination that they have been through and kind of ostracization that they have been through. So those are some of the examples that I showed. Yeah.
So if to just, so you're saying you're defining empathy and care, like you are defining it. It's not based.
Yes. Yes. I'm the one defining it. Yes. Yeah.
And so can you go back to the slide on your theoretical framework and the literature review or conceptual framing?
Just 1 second. I'm sorry about this. Yeah.
So, and there was one more slides on decoloniality, I think on decoloniality that you were using. Okay,
This
so
one?
where these authors come in, like how is your work drawing on decolonial theory? How is your work drawing on queer theory? Why you haven't used any sort of literature on, there's a vast amount of literature on care theories about care labor. Why are not you using any care from all of that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. So the kind of research that I've done is not only on digital diasporas. So it's the work that I have done is on feminist as well as queer movements, but thinking through like how these communities are actually representing themselves, how the conversation about them is happening on these spaces, which means that these are not the only individuals that are participating here. So I would say that in this particular research, I'm not only talking about LGBTQ communities, but also talking about how others are perceiving them, right? And you're absolutely right that there is a lot of literature on queerness and diasporas that I may not have looked at, but because this is more of like a research on digital discourses and digital activism and how these communities are actually participating in that conversation. I'm actually using this queer theory and decolonial theory as sort of frameworks to look at power, to like examine power. And I understand that this doesn't show up in this particular research, but again, as we talked about earlier, if you go through some of my other work that's related to this project, you'll see how I'm using power and feminist and queer frameworks to actually thinking about digital activism, how it should be designed on these spaces, and what it means to actually have conversations about intersectionality and feminism and queerness. Yeah.
So while others type in the questions, let me ask a question, Nanditha.
Yes,
so in your research, digital spaces are central to practice solidarity for queer subaltern causes. And since power is an important consideration, could you clarify how the power politics of digital spaces, example, the Twitter politics, the ownership and capitalism of the digital spaces is related to, or what's the articulation between the politics of digital spaces and the queer politics of resistance? Could you comment on that?
Right. I think the connection is, I would say, contemporary. So this is like a contemporary fourth wave movement, whether it's talking about Me Too India or Section 377. So this is kind of like emerging, like as a movement. It's always existed on offline spaces, and of course there's been a lot of conversations about queerness, and a lot of these safe spaces that have always existed on social media, even whether it's blogs or like dating sites and so on. So I think that Twitter and Instagram and all of these public sites that have come into being very recently have enabled some of these conversations to happen in public. And so I think that this fourth wave movement, this queer movement, or like which is in parallel to like other movements like the feminist movement in India, have actually pushed us in thinking about this in a very public way, because a lot of our earlier conversations were happening in private spaces, and so it's a moment of reckoning in that way. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Dr. Narayanamoorthy? Does anyone want to read the question, or? So I'll go ahead and ask another question, which I personally am interested in. What are some of the limitations of this research? If you were to do this research again, are there any things that you would do differently in the approach?
Yes, absolutely. I think that based on the questions that thoughtful questions that everyone put through, I think it would be important to kind of juxtapose this research that's only happening on social media to kind of add to, and I would actually think about like doing more ethnographic research in addition to social media. So of course, I talked about the power of social media and bringing these voices into the public platform. But of course, there are a lot of conversations that are important to have, whether it's about caste dynamics or feminism or transgenderism. And, in terms of like even thinking about the perception of Section 377 and the decriminalization of homosexuality within the diaspora community. So I think that I would take the time to actually meet with more organizations or talk to people as a social scientist and an observer of like how social activism takes place. I would like to interact with some of these people and users. And also I was interested in also creating a digital archive of sorts, based off on like how some of these communities actually talk about their own selves, and using these platforms as a space to come out and also create these sort of like invisible networks with their counterparts in India. Yeah. Thank you.
I think our participants are interested to see if you would share the slides. If there are a couple of questions on the chat, and there is a.
Okay, sure, absolutely, yes.
There's a question from Lindsay Thompson about, the question is, are there specific ethnographic pieces that you would like to be involved in?
I wanted to clarify what you mean by ethnographic pieces. I think mostly I would be interested in doing archival research, and also like making sure that I'm excavating some of these actual marginalized voices. And the second way for me to do that would be to talk to some of these communities.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to thank everyone who were here. Thank you so much, Dr. Nanditha Narayanamoorthy, for your excellent talk about queer activism in the Indian digital diasporas. I'd like to remind everyone about the Circle Graduate South Asia Conference. Please go to our website. The call for proposal is open. Again, thank you so much for your participation. We wish everyone a good summer from Circle. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.